Hello and welcome to what is part number 3 of Charles V and the Holy Roman Empire. If you haven't seen part number 1 and 2 yet, please go give those a watch first. The link is in the description of the video down below. Let's get into this. We left off in 1530. Charles had just been crowned King of Rome by Clement VII, the Pope, the last person to ever be crowned by a Pope. And while you're here, please consider liking, commenting, and most importantly, subscribing. Although Charles had win over the French and the League of Cognac, a new foe entered into Charles's domain. Charles, the Christian king, would see them as the very Antichrist. The Ottoman Empire was growing and growing under their Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent. A year earlier, in 1529, he actually took his army all the way to the capital of Austria in Vienna, where they sieged it for 3 weeks, constantly bombarding the city. But eventually the Austrians started to regain control over the area and would win out against the Ottomans. But this was a very big wake-up call for Charles. He realized that he was no longer the one and only big fish in the sea. This, of course, is the continuation of wars against the Islamic states and the European Christendom states. Charles, more than ever, needed a unified Christendom to fight these religious wars. But a few years earlier, Martin Luther created something called Protestantism, meaning that Christianity was divided. In 1530, he held the Diet of Augsburg to reduce the tensions between Charles and these Protestant German princes, but ultimately it failed. He was on the ropes here. How was he going to get himself out of this pickle? That's when he realized he was a Habsburg, who have a slogan, Bella Grant Ali tu Felix Austria nub, which means, let others wage war, but you, happy Austria, marry. He looked to his foe, Francis I of France, and realized they were both Catholic kings and would do well to create an alliance. Charles had a sister called Eleanora, who was a widow after her husband Manuel I of Portugal died. So he offered her hand in marriage to Francis, who was a widower himself. This was a purely political marriage, and an extremely unhappy one. Could you imagine marrying someone that you don't know, especially when they are the sister of your enemy, or giving your sister's hand in marriage to your enemy? All I can say is it was definitely duty, but wow, could you imagine? In 1532, Charles took part in the Diet of Regensburg, which would see him enforcing one of the first modernized judicial systems in Europe. I say modern, this legal system still used things like execution by fire if a person was caught guilty with witchcraft, but it unified the kingdom in a way that it hadn't been unified before, because now the German states and the imperial states were unified under the same legal system, meaning that you could commit a crime anywhere in the Holy Roman Empire and be tried the same way. Now, back to war. In 1532, the Ottoman forces were still in Europe, and they made a push for Vienna once more. But this time, they had 100,000 men with them, and Charles realized they needed more attention to this. So he sent his brother Ferdinand, who was the king of Hungary and Croatia at the time, to sort things out. Amazingly, there was something called the Battle of the Siege of Gunz, which saw 700 Croatian soldiers held out against 100,000 Ottoman soldiers. 700, 100,000. The Croats won. They stopped the Ottomans advancing to Vienna. At the same time, Charles led his army down the Danube and saw the Ottomans retreat. Angry with being attacked by the Islams, he went to North Africa and attacked Tunis, which was in the Ottoman Caliphate, in 1535, capturing a few towns, but in reality it wasn't very successful because it did nothing for him. The Ottomans' strength wasn't there. Nonetheless, he was happy with life, and he even led a triumphal journey through Italy, which was somewhat of a kickback to the ancient Roman Empire, and he went to go see the new Pope, Paul III. And he did what he always did. He complained about Francis, who had taken the Duchy of Savoy and even the city of Turin, which was dangerously close to the battlefield of Europe, the Dukedom of Milan. Here, for all of Charles's political prowess, he challenged Francis to a personal combat to end their rivalry, kind of like Game of Thrones. Francis declined, and the Pope was angry with this. This meant one thing: war with France again. For the next 2 years, Charles stayed in northern Italy, making sure that he would have the upper hand against his foe, Francis, and he chased him all the way into Provence in France, but ultimately he failed to capture him. And then Pope Paul III came and met with Charles and said, right, you got to sort this out, have a peace treaty in Nice, which they did. He then went to go stay with his sister Anne Francis in France in 1538. I can just imagine how awkward that must have been. He was, however, called away because there was a birth of his next child in 1539. Unfortunately, the child was stillborn, and this caused complications with his wife Isabella, who died a few days later. Charles, of course, was a widower now, and he was sad. So he travelled to his Low Countries where he grew up, and when he was there, he witnessed the punishment of Ghent after an uprising in the city. Here we can see people starting to really become unsettled with the rulership of the Holy Roman Empire. It was too divided, so he called for something called the Diet of Regensburg again in 1541 to try and untie all these complicated religious divisions, but he failed. He went to Rome to meet Paul III, who apparently sowed the seeds of crusade in Charles's head. Both the Pope and Charles were getting concerned over the Ottomans, so Charles went and attacked Algiers, and he failed. As a young man, Charles went from victory to victory to victory. Now at the age of 41, he was becoming a failure. As Spain held the key to the New World, they unfortunately had the right to choose the rules of the land, meaning they could choose the laws of the land, even though there were people living there before. And Francis, the King of France, wasn't very happy about this because he also wanted a slice of the American pie, which, you guessed it, led to war between Charles and Francis, again for the 1000th time. Only Charles joined forces with England and the man who left the papal protection to create his own church, Henry VIII. Now, why did Charles need to join forces with Henry VIII of England? Well, Francis did something that shocked Christendom. He and Suleiman, the Ottoman Sultan, formed an alliance. This was unacceptable to Charles, and after 2 years of fighting, I'm afraid to say no one really won. Because they signed a treaty, Charles gave up his right to his Duchy of Burgundy, which he didn't actually have, and Francis gave up his kingdoms of Naples and Flanders, which he also didn't have, so there was no point in this treaty or no point in this war. The only significant thing here was Charles got Francis to support him if he ever needed to fight against Henry VIII, who wasn't a Catholic, as well as fighting against the German Protestant princes who weren't Catholic. We can see that the two Catholic monarchs really felt strongly about being Catholic. 2 years later, in 1546, Charles did something that was very un-Catholic. He started having an affair with someone called Barbara Blumberg, who was a singer. And she would bear him an illegitimate son. Of course, they were born out of wedlock, so he was a bastard, Don John of Austria. And he was kept away from the family, making sure that no one knew of this scandal. But eventually, Don John became quite a strong military leader for Charles's son and heir, Philip, Don John's half-brother. The same year, the German princes formed something called the Shmeltic League, which was made up of Protestants. And they were backed by the biggest anti-papist of the day, Henry VIII of England, and they declared war against Catholicism. This was Christians fighting against Christians. Charles would head the Catholics with the backing of the Pope, and he would win. He was so happy that he was finally back on a winning streak. In 1547, both his greatest friends and his greatest foes passed away. Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France passed away in the same year. Charles realized age was catching up with him. He was the age of 47 and he called his son Philip to meet him in his Low Countries. Here in 1549, he started to teach his son about the rulership and wrote his memoirs in 1550. This caused a rift in his family in 1551, as the younger generations weren't too sure about the rulership of an ever-dividing empire, especially with how the German princes, who were once their staunch supporters, were unhappy with being ruled by someone who didn't even share the same religion as them. Here Charles decided to divide his house into the Habsburg Spanish branch and the Habsburg Austrian branch. Protestantism was really spreading further and further, and the German princes were getting stronger and stronger. Charles was getting really worried about this, and he was thinking, what can I do? So he sent his brother Ferdinand to Germany to talk to the Protestant princes, because they always had a really good relationship. But this didn't work at all. The Protestants revolted once more, and Charles was at war again with Christians, and he hated this. And he was in Germany at the time, but he was forced to flee to Austria because it was quite dangerous for him, and he almost got caught. Eventually, the princes signed the Treaty of Passau, and Charles's brother Ferdinand convinced him to give the Protestants their religious freedom and end 30 years of religious wars. In 1552, Charles decided he wanted one last hurrah against his old foe, France, and he attacked Mainz, but he failed completely. People perhaps felt the soldier of his youth was no longer there, but the politician was now wise and wily. Mary I ascended the throne of England as queen, but she needed a king. Charles saw an opportunity of a lifetime here, another throne for his family. He organized the marriage of his son Philip to Mary in 1554, who would become King of England. The next year, in 1555, Charles's mad mother passed away. Perhaps he could see his time was coming to a close as well. He abdicated his rulership over the Low Countries. A year later, then, he abdicated his kingship of Spain in favor for his son. And a few months later, on August the 3rd, 1556, he abdicated the Holy Roman Imperial throne for his brother Ferdinand. Charles's body was battered after years of rulership. He had been constantly on a horse, he had gout, he couldn't walk properly, he had spent hours in hot baths aiding his aching bones. He moved to a monastery called Uppbeat, where he relaxed. In 1558, he caught malaria, and at the age of 58, he died in his sleep. He was buried at the monastery, but later moved to another monastery of San Lorenzo dell'Escorial, where he was reunified with Isabella. The couple's remains were moved once more in 1654 to the royal pantheon of the kings by their great-grandson. Was he a bad ruler? Was he a great ruler? Was he, in fact, a person that was in the right place at the right time? Whatever your thoughts are, he was a man that made the most of whatever he had. He was a man that had half the world under his rulership and still saw himself as a failure. Thank you very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed that. Like, comment, subscribe, the more you know.